Heart failure due to diseases of the arteries is the greatest single cause of death in the civilized world. One of these diseases is high blood pressure. Blood pressure is easy to measure.
Is it high, Doctor?
It's a little high right now, but I want to check it again tomorrow, and maybe again after that.
That was a clip from a film made by Britannica Films in 1954 about the causes of heart disease and how to manage it. Fast forward more than half a century later and come to find out that heart disease is still the #1 killer of Americans. Hippocrates, commonly referred to as the father of medicine, once said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." He, unlike many Americans today, understood the profound effects of diet on human health. To understand the current state of health of Americans, I would like to lay out a few statistics. Americans are the biggest consumers of weight loss products in the world. The percentage of American children and adolescents who are considered overweight or obese has tripled since 1970. 70% of adults across the U.S. have a chronic disease, and 75% of the nation's healthcare cost is being spent on treating and managing these conditions. Most chronic conditions can be treated or avoided through diet and exercise. Treatment of the 7 most common chronic conditions costs the U.S. more than $1 trillion annually. 360,000 Americans die per year from diseases directly related to obesity and unhealthy lifestyle. About 3%, or 1 in 33 babies, are born with birth defects. And last but certainly not least, this generation will be the first to live shorter lives than their parents. Through examining these statistics, it's clear that the health of Americans are in an extreme state of turmoil, and this is largely because of what we put in our mouth. Many people fail to realize the extreme complexity of our bodies and how efficient they are at survival. So although you may feel okay consuming a diet largely consisting of industrial waste for years, eventually it will catch up to you, manifesting itself as a sudden heart attack, a diagnosis of diabetes, Alzheimer's, arthritis, depression, or one of the many other common chronic diseases. When you deprive oneself of essential vitamins and minerals through consuming a sad or standard American diet, your body has no other choice than to borrow from the skeleton. So yes, you can survive on a sad diet, albeit often with sudden and extreme consequences, but it's time that we start realizing the radical effects of eating a nutrient-dense diet. What's insane is how advanced of a society we have developed in some respects, but how completely ignorant we are in other aspects such as diet. Many so-called primitive societies were completely free of our illnesses, hence the name Western diseases, or diseases of civilization. Yet our arrogance has pushed this fact aside, as if it was and is not applicable to the modern people of today. People in these primitive societies would often travel great distances to obtain foods they consider to have special qualities for maintaining a high degree of immunity to disease. Food that is much easier to obtain now, but has largely been demonized by dogmatic so-called scientific views. Although these primitive peoples could not tell you the exact chemical makeup of the food, the protein, fat, and carbohydrate content, and the specific vitamins and minerals contained within the food, they didn't recognize the special reproductive growth or other supporting qualities of the food, a sense that is largely lost to modern man. In the words of Dr. Price, the only hunger of which we now are conscious is hunger for energy to keep us warm and to supply power. In general, we stop eating when an adequate amount of energy has been provided, whether or not the bodybuilding and repairing materials have been included in the food. To understand the diets of these primitive peoples, it's important to examine the work of Dr. Weston A. Price. Dr. Weston A. Price, also known as the Isaac Newton of nutrition, was a Cleveland dentist living from 1870 to 1948 that we all are indebted to for his voluminous studies and tireless efforts to improve the health of humans. In the early 1900s, Dr. Weston A. Price set off to find a solution to the growing epidemic of caries, teeth, and other dental defects in the United States. At the time, it was known that the so-called primitive, isolated peoples untouched from modern civilization had excellent teeth. So he set off in his travels to study these primitive, isolated tribes, trying to ascertain what aspect of their life afforded them their magnificent dental condition, and what Americans might be lacking. What he found that was much more profound than he could have foreseen. Through his studies of isolated tribe after tribe, he found what seemed to be an immunity from Western diseases, magnificent dental development despite their limited or non-existent dental hygiene, and strongness of character and morality that was evident if not by their extreme hospitality, then by their complete lack of jails or prisons. This all remained true as long as they stayed away from modern influences of white bread, white rice, marmalades, added sugar, and other processed foods. What seemed to afford them this higher state of being was simply living in accordance with nature's laws, as Price put it, or in other words, eating a diet of whole nutrient-dense foods, which provided them with the raw materials for mind, body, and character building of the highest degree. A few notable, isolated peoples Price came across in his travels were, as he details in his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. People in the high alpine valleys of Switzerland ate mainly rye bread and dairy products, consuming meat once per week and various vegetables fresh in the summer and stored for winter. A study of 4,280 of their teeth revealed that only 3.4% of the studied teeth had been attacked by tooth decay. Those who had a diet influenced by modern civilization had 9 times the original rate of dental decay, at 29.8% of the teeth studied being affected. People of the Outer Hebrides of the UK ate mainly oat products and seafood. Vegetables were eaten fresh in the summer and stored for winter. Organ meats such as the liver were also prized. A study of their teeth revealed 1.3 teeth out of every 100 to be affected by tooth decay. Less than 10 miles away, people near a shipping port, which brought over large supplies of processed foods, had 32.4 out of every 100 teeth being affected, almost 25 times the original rate of dental decay. Eskimos of Alaska had a diet which put great emphasis upon organ meats of the marine life. Caribou meat was eaten when available, and seal meat was specially prized. Berries, including cranberries, were occasionally consumed. Several plant foods were gathered in the summer for winter use. Fish eggs were dried in season and used liberally for children, and were recognized as supporting growth and reproduction. Interestingly, they ate the inner layer of skin on a specific species of whale, which was found to be high in vitamin C. A study of 2,138 teeth revealed only 2 or 0.09% of the teeth had been attacked by tooth decay. Those who partially ate modern foods had an incidence of 394 teeth out of 2,254 being affected, 13% or a 144-fold increase. Indians of a Rocky Mountain range far north of Canada. 9 months of the year they solely ate wild game, with great importance put upon the organ meats of the animals. Most of the muscle meat was fed to the dogs. Skeletal remains of the animals were found as piles of finely broken bone chips, or splinters that had been cracked open to obtain the marrow. During the summer, plants were consumed as well. Out of 2,464 teeth examined, only 4 or 0.16% had been affected by tooth decay. Nearby groups with increasing contact with modern civilization had a progressively increasing rate of tooth decay, reaching 25.5% of all teeth examined. Native tribes in eastern and central Africa. The more agricultural groups ate large quantities of sweet potatoes and fish, as they were available, with beans and some cereals. Other tribes who were focused mainly on animal life consumed the blood, milk, and meat of the animal, along with some insects, including ants and locusts. The Maasai tribe, focused mainly on animal life, had only 10 teeth out of 2,516 affected by decay, or 0.4%. The Kikuyu, a mostly agricultural group, had 57 out of 1,041 teeth affected by decay, or 5.5%. The Aborigines of Australia, those near the sea, ate marine life liberally, along with plants and animals of the land. The more inland depended mostly upon land animals, particularly the wallaby, kangaroo, and small animals and rodents, eating all edible parts of the animal. The Australian Aborigines were accredited by Dr. Price as having the most superb teeth and dental arch formations of all tribes he studied. Price found the isolated Aborigines, untouched by modern civilizations, to have dental decay incidence of 0.00%, whereas those who consumed modernized foods had as high as 70.9% of all teeth examined affected. Some interesting side notes are that through his travels, Dr. Price never came across a healthy tribe of isolated peoples living entirely off of plant foods. Several tribes recognize the importance of not only the proper nutrition of the mother, but also the father for strong and healthy offspring. The primitive people who adopted modern cuisine and then proceeded to have children had deformities within the first generation. For example, narrow dental arch, crowding of the teeth, small nasal passages, and even narrowing of the hips, particularly affecting women in childbirth. Price noted that childbirth among the primitive peoples was relatively quick and painless. Through examinations of these isolated people's diets, we see that their protein, fat, and carbohydrate content varied wildly. But when reduced to their vitamin and mineral content, they're extremely similar. They also ate 0 processed foods, 0 added sugar, and focused solely on whole and nutrient-dense foods. When examined by Dr. Price, their diets provided at least 4 times the calcium and other minerals, and an astounding 10 times the fat-soluble vitamins of the American diet. Yet even more astounding is their inherent immunity from Western diseases, such as heart disease, diabetes, obesity, dental decay, and so on, as long as they consume their traditional diets. At this point, you might be wondering why you were told not to eat fat, when these isolated peoples free from our Western diseases, such as the Maasai or the Eskimos, not only ate as high as 80% of their calories from fat, but depended largely upon fat for maintaining their high degree of immunity to disease. To answer this question, it is important to examine the work of Nina Teicholz and her book, The Big Fat Surprise, which so comprehensively displays the history of fat in the United States. In 1913, a Russian pathologist, Nikolai Nitschkow, reported that he can induce atherosclerotic-type lesions in rabbits by feeding them large amounts of cholesterol. The study caught the attention of many scientists and doctors around the world, and was replicated with many animals including cats, sheep, cattle, and horses. This study largely primed American scientists for the unrelenting assault on fat that would ensue decades later, in a manner similar to the future studies, as most of these animals are herbivores, and not biologically equipped to efficiently metabolize cholesterol, therefore not being applicable to humans, or simply flawed and designed for the conclusions extrapolated. In fact, when the study was done with dogs, the scientists failed to induce the atherosclerotic type lesions that the herbivores developed, but the study had already garnered too much national attention. Decades later, in the 50s, Pete Ahrens, the leading lipidologist of his day at Rockefeller University, set up the first gas liquid chromatography lab in the US and began experimenting with different kinds of fats. Around the same time, Ansel Keys, a biologist and pathologist at the University of Minnesota, began conducting his own experiments with the goal of finding a preventative measure against heart disease. Keys conducted ethically questionable experiments among male schizophrenic patients at a nearby Minnesota hospital, feeding them diets ranging from 9 to 24% fat diets for a period ranging from 2 to 9 weeks, consisting of a meager 66 people. The results, Keys found that the lower fat group performed slightly better to lower cholesterol, but incidentally failed to include the number of people during his original publication. In a 1952 presentation at Mount Sinai in New York, Keys formally introduced his diet heart hypothesis, which included his 6-country study, displaying an undeniable correlation between fat intake and occurrences of heart disease. Keys promoted these early findings without fail as if they were undeniable, stating, "No other variable in the mode of life besides the fat calories in diet is known which shows anything like such a consistent relationship to mortality rate from coronary or degenerative heart disease." On September 23, 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower suffered a heart attack which further enshrined the ideas of Keys when Paul White, Eisenhower's personal doctor, gave the American public a lecture on heart disease and how to prevent it, stop smoking, reduce stress, and lessen the intake of saturated fat and cholesterol. Interestingly enough, Eisenhower died of heart disease in 1969 despite the fact that he religiously avoided saturated fat. Although he was an avid smoker years before his first heart attack, which might have contributed to his death as well. Soon after, Jacob Yerushalmi, the founder of the Biostatistics Department at the University of California, Berkeley, criticized the work of Keys, pointing out that he seemed to exclude otherwise available data for a 6-country study. In Yerushalmi's own 22-country study, the correlation between the amount of fat eaten and incidences of heart disease is drastically reduced. Keys responded that the graph was deeply flawed because national statistics were unreliable due to war and also the variances of diagnosis of heart disease between countries. While the statement was true, Keys used data from the same source 2 years prior for his undeniable 6-country study graph. 1 year later, during the year of 1956, with a grant of $200,000 from the Public Health Service, Keys launched his 7-country study, with standardized data and on-the-ground surveys for accurate data to utilize. Although he seemed to choose countries that would only support his hypothesis, rather than challenge it by including a country like France or the Netherlands, what he found was a strong correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease. Despite the seemingly conclusive results of the study, there are some definite problems with the data. For example, Eastern Finns died about 3 times more of heart disease than did Western Finns, notwithstanding their identical lifestyle. In addition, on the island of Corfu, chances of dying from heart disease were significantly higher than on Crete, where more saturated fat. Of 12,770 participants, only 499 or 3.9% of them had their food evaluated. In Greece alone, they used 3 different chemical methods for testing fats in the foods, and the results did not match up. Keys then opted to publish this undesirable dietary data in a desk journal that he knew would go unnoticed. Earlier in his career, he wrote of his frustrations of a paper he published in voting, which received no international attention. And on top of it all, this was an epidemiological study, which at best can prove correlation, but certainly not causation. 25 years later, Alessandro Manati, the lead Italian researcher of the study, re-examined the study and discovered some interesting things. The strongest correlation with coronary mortality was actually sweets, having a correlation of 0.821, while fats had a correlation of 0.798. In addition, had chocolate, ice cream, and soda been included in the sweet category, and margarine been excluded from the animal fats category, sweets might have had a stronger correlation, while fats might have had a weaker correlation. In the years of 1957 and 1958, Keys decided to indulge in a few more rounds of experimentation in those same schizophrenic patients at that nearby Minnesota hospital, and then concluded that it was in fact saturated fat and not total fat that increased risk of coronary mortality. While Keys was tirelessly promoting his own ideas, Pete Ahrens was rigorously researching triglycerides, which then led him to the idea of carbohydrates possibly being responsible for obesity and other diseases. His highly controlled liquid formula feeding diets that were conducted from 1951 through 1964 consistently showed triglycerides to rise with carbohydrate intake. In a study comparing New Haven coronary patients with healthy employees at a nearby Stillwater, they found that high triglyceride levels were far more common than high cholesterol in the coronary patients. In fact, recent studies have shown that more than half of coronary patients have cholesterol levels within the normal range. Ahrens then found that triglycerides would cloud the blood with a milky white liquid. Since diabetics tend to have higher triglycerides, and a disease being associated with a higher risk of developing heart disease, the commonality between the two must be excessive weight gain. Thus, whatever made people fat also spiked triglycerides and led to heart disease, the probable cause being carbohydrates. Although Pete Ahrens was the most revered lipidologist of his day, his ideas simply did not gain the traction that they deserved. And with the backing of the National Institute of Health, the American Heart Association, and Time magazine, the ideas of Keyes were institutionalized for more than half of a century and still linger on today. On the other side of the coin, new research indicates that total cholesterol is not a reliable predictor of heart disease. Dietary cholesterol has little to no effect on serum cholesterol levels. In fact, when more dietary cholesterol is taken in through dietary means, the production of cholesterol by the body is simply lowered. Low total cholesterol is associated with an increased risk of developing cancer, among other things like a higher risk of depression and suicide. Saturated fat actually increases HDL levels, the so-called good cholesterol. And finally, that cholesterol in and of itself is not bad. It's actually an extremely important chemical used by every single cell in the body, aiding in the formation of hormones and acting as a brain antioxidant. So now that we've examined the diets used by primitive people to build superb physiques and maintain excellent health alongside an understanding of the flawed science that demonize saturated fat and cholesterol, we can finally get back to the point of the video. That being, why is diet so important for health? We'll simply refer back to the state of health that Americans are currently in, ever since we're advised to lower saturated fat and protein intake, and to substantially increase our vegetable oil and carbohydrate intake, which is largely composed of processed foods that are nutrient-devoid, sugar-laden, highly palatable, hormonally disruptive, industrial waste products that we've been conned into thinking is healthful because it's cholesterol-free or USDA approved. This implicates diet in playing a role in preventing or failing to prevent heart disease, obesity, cancer, stroke, depression, arthritis, and virtually every other disease of civilization, along with deformities and mental and moral deterioration. The association of abnormalities of the palate with mental deficiency has long been recognized. One study found that abnormalities of the palate occurred in 19% of normal people, 33% of the insane, 55% of criminals, and 61% of people with an intellectual disability. Another study found that this occurred in 82% of people with an intellectual disability and 80% of the insane. In effect, diet plays a role in your mental, moral, and physical development, which further impacts every single facet of life. With all that said, I'm not advocating change in your preferred macronutrients. After all, we're all different, and the one-size-fits-all dietary recommendations that the government and other organizations have tried to give us has utterly failed. I simply advocate for a nutrient-dense whole foods diet, which isn't afraid of incorporating fat-soluble vitamins. It's time that we stop blaming new diseases on old food.